Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually really delves into the world of geopolitics. And that's the world that I define as the world that basically tells us what we know, what we should think, what we do. And it's how different states interact with that process. How the United States interacts with the United Kingdom, say, or the West in general. Or how China interacts with its people in Asia, or other parts of the world like the United States, how the United States reacts to it, or Russia to other parts of Europe, or other parts of Europe to Russia, or indeed how Africa actually to itself relates its differences, and how other parts of the world relate to Africa. So within this, you can see that the conglomerate is how the world functions, what it thinks, what it does, and how we get that received knowledge and information, and bias, obviously, most often, and how it functions. Now, that's quite important because today I'll be doing what I call a critical thinking episode. And this one relates to Black history. Now, in itself, Black history is a misnomer. How is Black history any different than white history? How is it any different than whatever terminology you want to use for the history of, say, the Chinese people or people in East Asia? So, in a sense, it's a misnomer. However, because of that geopolitics which I spoke about before, because of how the world has been given a view of how Black people are, then politically, Black history has been required. And I could argue that in the United Kingdom, at least, I was probably one of the people that put this into the mind of Sir Herman Ouseley. I guess you can ask him. As a young officer, I went to the Commission for Racial Equality, having been a detective for the Americans, where they had Black History Month in America. I went to Sir Herman Ouseley and said, who was then the head of the Commission for Racial Equality, and said to him, we need to do the same in the United Kingdom, because without what we're calling Black history, people have been provided with a skewed vision of Black people, particularly in the United Kingdom, because that's what we're talking about, the UK, but, indeed in Europe, Africa, the Americas, the Far East, the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, the rest of the world. So it's actually of great import that so-called Black history was brought about. Now, having said all of that, and some of you having turned off, you won't hear anymore, hopefully you haven't, joking aside. Having said all of that, what I will say is what I always say is that race, as we perceive it, in terms of black, white, Negro, Caucasian, Mongoloid, is a nonsense. It's a total and utter nonsense. So biologically, it is non-existent. However, and this is what I've always stressed, politically, it is one of the most real things that you can have because of the muck of ages, because of what has been spread out in the past. So this is why we need the Black History Month. This is why I need now to explain what that is and to deal with it in, I guess, 3 or 4 different ways. I'm going to start with the perspective of dealing with it in 3 different ways. Regular listeners to the show will know that I'm a criminologist. And what I did for my dissertation, I created something that I call the balance theory. And it was important in the world of criminal justice because, in the United Kingdom in particular, because when I first joined the police in the United Kingdom, the vast majority of officers, as they are today to be fair, were white. And there were very, very few black officers. And the reason why I called my theory the balance theory was because I believed if you didn't have a balance about how you deal with individuals who don't look like you, what you revert to is the stereotype which you've been provided. So I noticed that a lot of white officers, no different to white people in any other facet of life, be they teachers, be they doctors, be they nurses, be they clergymen or clergywomen, whatever, firefighters, whatever they were, had a view of what they thought black people were. And oftentimes that view was negative. Because, of course, if you've had a slave trade and you've demonified the black people as less than human and use them as enslaved beasts of burden, then you're not going to give to those people any positive perspective. So the balance theory was to actually explain how when an officer now, in the modern era, deals with an individual, that, what I'm calling the muck of ages, sits in his or her head, and all they think is, I'm told these people are dangerous, lazy, sloth-like, etc., etc. That's what I've been educated to. Now, it has changed over the time from when I joined in the police service back in the early 80s to how it is today. That change has happened and come around, and not everybody feels that way. But actually, I could play you tapes, I won't do because I won't have time in the programme, where you would have heard how people did perceive blacks and thought of them because that's how they were educated. So it was then pretty much assured that when police were dealing with black people, they were already dealing with them with the perspective of them being a problem, and in terms of the United Kingdom, with the perspective of them actually having done nothing for the country other than come and take something from the country. Because the history of blacks being in Britain, playing a part in Britain, the 2,000-year history, had never been told to them. It's quite interesting because I now see a backlash. And I was just looking for this programme. I was looking at how people are perceiving black history. And I saw a hell of a lot of what they called debunking black history. People saying this was not the case and this person wasn't black and that person wasn't black and etc., etc. And trying to say that it's just wokeism that says people here and there were black. So this is going to be the first part of me explaining how that perspective as to who's black and who isn't comes into play, and how, in order to understand what I am calling black, or somebody else may be calling black, and somebody else may be calling white, or somebody else may be calling mongoloid, is really fully weighted with rubbish, frankly, nonsense. However, if you take on the teachings of the day and the teachings as they were in the past, then you've got to say to yourself, okay, we're going to call this person black and that person black and that person not. So it's how we perceive who somebody is. And that is what is important. And that isn't static, by the way. It's not static in a particular country. So the first question has to be is, who said who is black? I guess we can say that the kind of invention of race in terms of Europe, because, Britain's in Europe, so let's go with that to start off with, was really a Swedish naturalist called Carolus Linnaeus. And he proposed classifications of humankind into 4 distinct races. Now, he did that because he was making a system of classification of all things. And he believed that within that, he could classify humans in exactly the same way as Homo sapiens and place them in genus homonos or homogenus. So he actually came up with the kind of 4 classifications. And indeed, there's been 6 classifications, and there's been 3 classifications, and there's been 5 classifications. So really, who do we choose? So if we looked at 1735, we'd be saying Linnaeus and what his classifications were. But then I guess the one that really began to stick better and the best would be in round about 1775, round that area. And another naturalist by the name of Johann Blumenbach, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach to be precise, and he proposed that the races should be split into Cascoid, Mongoloid, Ethiopian, and American and Malayan races. Now, I guess we understand most of them, so you could argue that the Cascoid were what we see as Europeans now, and also they pushed down into what is now North Africa, and across into some parts of Asia, what we call Asia. Then you had the Mongoloid race, which was more so into East Asia, into that region as he perceived it. You had the Ethiopian race as he saw it, which was Africa, not only south of the Sahara, but pushing up a little bit from beyond there into Ethiopia, and then also pushing up a little bit, some parts into Libya and around that area, but pushing down generally. We also had the which later became the Negroid race. And then we had the American Indian race, which actually, as far as he perceived it, covered the whole of the Americas. Now, if you know anything about the whole of the Americas before the coming of the European, I think it's difficult to cite all of those people as one people, but that's the way he did it. Indeed, it's difficult to cite all Europeans as one people, or all Africans as one people, or all East Asians as one people. And then he had the Malayan race, which others have sort of detailed differently. Some have even said the Negroid race, whatever. So this is where the idea came about from Blumenbach. So the reason why I dispute all of that is because what he seemed to do was to say the people who I think... And by the way, I've been correct in saying that, because what he didn't do is classify the races as inferior or superior. He didn't do that. That was subsequently done by others. And others, because I mean at one stage, in some of the race classifications from Linnaeus, I believe, he had Hungarians in a different race to Europeans. So you see, you could play around with what you call races, because it's easy to suggest what's what. And so this is where it becomes problematic. And this is why it's quite important for us to explain that. So also, to move further forward, the Mexicans, people we call Mexicans now, in the United States, who lived in the United States, have been classified on several different occasions as different. Some of them were classed as white, because the Americans then dropped this Caucasian and just said white, black, whatever. Some were classed as white for one period of time. Then they were classed not as white, as black. Then they were reclassified again. So this race has always been a problem. And to give you the very, very best example of that in the United States, in some of the southern states of the United States, so the states that broke away from the Union in the American Civil War, you had different classifications as to what was black. And for some of the states, if you were 1/8 black, so you had 1/8 black in you, then you were classed as black. Now, this was important because, of course, there were white-only fountains, white-only could this, or white-only schools, or white-only educational aspects, white-only employment. If you were black, you were enslaved, and if you were white, you weren't. So those classifications became important. And 1/8 of you was black, so 1/8 of your ancestors was black, you were classed as black. In some states, it was down to 1/16. And I've heard in parts of other states, it was down to 1/32. So therefore, if you had one drop of, it was called a one drop in the 137, one drop of black blood in you, you were black. So now, this is quite interesting, because the debunking that I spoke about just before I explained the racial categorizations are stating to people, well, they aren't black because they don't have woolly hair, as they put it on one video. Or they're not black because their skin is light. Well, your skin under the 1/32 rule could be totally white. Your skin under the 1/16 rule could be totally white. To be fair, under the 1/8 rule, it could be totally white. But if you had black within you, you were black. So that would, because you were mixed race. And effectively, that is what the whole of North Africa is, mixed race. And at a lot lesser level than 1/8, probably at 1/4 or even less than that within many people. So, and that also goes for places that were taken by the Moors from the 7th century through to the 14th century. So you had Moors, which, by the way, in most European language, the word Moor denotes black. So that's why they use the word. In Britain, they used to use the word blackamoor, because in the English language, Moor does not mean black. There isn't that word. But in German, say, example, Mohrenkopf means black head. More means black in the Latin languages, in the Romance languages, so Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., it means black. And the way that they differentiated between the Moors that had conquered them in 711 and ran them for 700 years, the way that they denoted between the black Moors, and Moor also meant Islamic, so they added that too, but they were looking at the colour of the individual when they were saying it. They basically called the lighter-skinned Moor, the lighter-skinned Muslim who was running them, as a tawny Moor. Now, if you know what tawny is, you can see it in today still in wine. If you have a tawny wine, it's a lighter shade of dark wine, a tawny, whereas Moran is a black colour. So even now you can see that Moors were black. So the Moors who first conquered into Europe were black, and then came with them tawny Moors, which you could see as Arab, which are a mixed race people. And under the American classification, those would all be blacks. The problem is, you see, is that when you have people who have something later on after the slave trade, because this is where everything changes really. The slave trade then makes the African slave trade I'm talking about, because of course slave, the word slave does not come from an African word, it comes from the word Slav, which were white people who were enslaved. They were Slavic people, and that was where the word came, because most of the slaves at one stage were Slavic in the West, so therefore they called them slave. That's where it came from, that word. That's the iconography of the word. So when you look at that, that's how you make that perspective. So when, example, Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, I can't see how somebody can discover something where people already are. What he actually said was that when he spoke with individuals on the continent of what we now call South America, but the Americas, they said they had had a people there before who were black people who'd come from across the seas, which obviously Africa's straight across the sea from them. And they said they'd seen these people and they were dark peoples. And many of the peoples, especially in the southern South America, were dark skinned. Now, these Europeans came and they were not all white because, of course, they were Spaniards, Italians, Portuguese, who were mixed with the Moors. So they were mixed race people, many of them. Now, because of the negative of the slave trade, of course, for many a year, until very, 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 very recently, you wouldn't find a Spaniard, or you wouldn't find a Portuguese, or you wouldn't find an Italian who would want to say that they were mixed with black people. So therefore, that was pushed aside. So this is the problem you've got. It becomes a very emotive thing to be black after the African slave trade. So hence, you get the taking away of the history. Hence, you get places like Egypt, ancient Egypt, being taken away from blacks. So even today, you'll get Egyptians, light-skinned Egyptians, turn around saying, no, they were not blacks who were in ancient Egypt, even though when we look at the iconography, i.e. how the people look, we can see that anybody with those characteristics and they'd committed a crime, we would turn around and say, that was a black guy because he looked like that with thick lips, he had curly hair, etc., etc., etc. Right? But they don't want to admit that because there's a negative to it. So this is how this whole area becomes actually very, very, very emotive. And so I'm trying to get out of the emotion, but I first had to touch on this so you could understand why it's emotive and why it's important that we first deal with that issue. You see, so this is, I don't like to deal with this sort of emotive aspect because I want to keep it kind of scientific, albeit it's non-scientific. I just want to keep it factual. So, you know, today, even in the United States, you will find people who turn around and say, that person's a Hispanic person, they're not black. Now, what that basically means is you can be as black as you wish to be, but if you have Hispanic or Latino, as you'll hear them say, heritage and speak Spanish from South America or Central America, or from the Caribbean, you can find that people will turn around to you and say they're not black, they're Hispanic. And that was the case with the people actually who conquered those areas from Europe. You can read many a history example where you see some French historians or more Northern Europeans who go to the court in the 16th century in Portugal and they turn around and say, they're black people. There's several historians who have said that. And you'll find likewise, going earlier to the 14th, 15th centuries in Spain, you'll hear that same statement. And also, if you go across to particularly the southern parts of Italy, you would hear that because of the ethnic and racial mixtures. Same with Greece, and indeed you can see various diseases that generally are hosted by black African people also sit within Greeks and southern Italians, and in, like sickle cell example, versions thereof. So, and historically now, of course, we're getting more and more used to looking at DNA. However, DNA is something that's quite questionable, because what you have to look at with DNA is what people state is their DNA. It just really means, it doesn't tell you what your race is, it just really means that these are the haplocytes which sit within a particular area of people. It doesn't necessarily provide you with who you are within that in terms of what we would call colour and race. So these are factors, but I wanted to clear that up because in order to go that step further now and to talk about black history in now part 2 of this aspect, I'm calling it part 2. It's actually, I'm sectioning it off. I've spoke about the biology, which is not really a biology at all. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's a biological nonsense, but it is a political reality thereof. And I'll leave you with just one quote that was provided to me by somebody who said, well, Barack Obama, when he became president, of course, Barack Obama, he's not really black, is he? You know, he's like, you know, just a darker skinned fella, but he's not really black. Yet still this same person, he was in the police, by the way, of Asian heritage, would see a person who was just the same colour as Barack Obama, and he'd say, oh, he's an IC3, which means black. So you see how people orientate themselves towards what somebody is based upon what that person is doing. So criminal, that's a black all day long. Becoming the most powerful person in the world, well, he's not really black. Now, why is that? And this person was what you could call an Asian person, whatever that means. So I would say he's of Asian heritage, again, whatever that means, probably from the Indians, not probably was from the Indian subcontinent. But of course, there's mixtures within that continent, as well of people from all over the place. And indeed, if we all were created from one African woman, which has been known as Lucy. Look that up. I'm not going to go back into the annals of history to tell you the first Homo sapiens sapien. But look that up and you'll see, then of course we're all some part of African anyway. And that's accepted now by all peoples. It wasn't by the Chinese for a while, but now even they have proved that is the case. Chinese scientists have proved that. So what I'm saying is all peoples are mixed. And there's been movement around the world forever and a day. It's not true that we've just started moving around the world. We've always been moving around the world. As you can see from the first movements out of Africa, how do you end up in Australasia? So that's what I would say as far as that's concerned. But just to now clarify, to get us onto the footsteps as to now black history in the United Kingdom and in Europe and beyond. So the first black people that I could see in the United Kingdom, if you want to really say that first, if you look at Cheddar Man, which is the so-called ancient Britain, his features are all dark, dark face, not like, let's say, an African from the Sudan, but you could say he would have features like an African from parts of South Africa, example. Or parts of Ethiopia. So this is the lunacy of race, in a sense. Dark-eyed, dark-haired, not necessarily curly, but then neither does an Ethiopian necessarily have curly black hair. So that was the first guy, the first Briton, as they called him. And if you want to see what he looks like, again, look that up. You can see that. In fact, I might actually start with that on the front of the episode. Or I may not. Then I would say to you that the other movements of blacks coming in before the Angles and Saxons, about 300-400 years before them, are the Romans. Now, the Romans were all different types of peoples, all phenotypes, all different colours. Some very black, like that Somalian, or less so Somalian, like that Sudanese. I think that some of the blackest people I can think of, like the Sudanese example, or the Dinka, like those type of people. Or, of course, they could be like the Ethiopian, or they could be white, what we would say white, like you see now, Middle European, or they could be very, very white, like a present Scandinavian, albeit that the original Scandinavians were probably much darker people, like the Sami, much darker people, and not the blonder, blue eyes sort of Norwegians that we think of, Viking types that we think of. So again, you got to be conceptualized with that as well. So in Britain, the next lot, I would say, as I said, were the Romans. You had an emperor there called Emperor Septimus Severus, meant to be from what is now today North Africa, Tunisia. Now, in those days, 2,000 years ago, these were not the people that you see there today in general. There was not the move from the lighter skinned people. They were generally a darker skinned people. And of course, many of much of the iconography shows him as darker. Some of it shows him with floppy, curly-ish hair. Some of it shows it with curlish hair, and because they're a statue, it looks like it's white, like he's white, but the whole thing's white, so it clearly wasn't that. But the paintings show you him as darker. Now, people who want to debunk this, when they talk about Septimus Severus, they like to say, well, they just showed him dark because they like to show women light. No, that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out because they're not showing Julius Caesar dark. So why are they showing Septimus Severus dark? That's a cop-out. You're making choices to try and prove who a person is and who isn't. So Septimus Severus came to Britain with Legianus Africanus, with his African legions, and he controlled Hadrian's Wall. He died in York in 210 AD, Anno Domini, and after the Christian era. And also there in York, if you go to the museum, round about the same time, you'll see Africa-bangled woman, who is an African woman, or a black woman, not necessarily from Africa, because it looks as though she's not from Africa. It looks as though she's from Southern Europe, but would be more African features, more like a Kenyan or somebody like that sort of features. And she's there from that same sort of time period, if not earlier. So it was not abnormal for ruling. And the fact that it's a bangle, and what they're trying to say is that she was a ruling elite. She was not any type of slave. She was a wealthy person because she was buried with wealthy accoutrements to her. So she was of power, the same way as the emperor was. And of course, they had Legianus Africanus with them, as I said to you. Now, recently, we have seen, for the people who are trying to debunk Septimus Severus and his African armies, we have seen that they have done DNA on people up in Cumbria and other places like that, who it shows that their DNA has some African aspect to them, and they don't know where that comes from. Well, I suggest to you that's coming from that era, way back 2,000 years ago. So we know this. Now, why does that matter? Some will argue it doesn't. But I'd say it does, because what it shows is that there's been an African presence in this country, Britain, for many years, for 2,000 years, and that we didn't just arrive on the Windrush after the Second World War in 1948. So it's contextualising. There's other Africans that are known that were up in Scotland, some were up in the 14th, 13th, 14th century. Now, the point is with this, as with all histories, most of the time, a man's or a woman's colour didn't matter in terms of it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't a reason to say they were a lesser human being. So therefore, it wasn't necessarily noted. It only became that way after the real take-hold of the African slave trade, and really only the African slave trade as it related to the Anglo English-speaking peoples, to be fair. I can put it that way. Don't get me wrong, if you were an enslaved African under Portuguese, under Spanish, under French, under Swedish rule, etc., it mattered, but it didn't matter in the same level as it seems to have mattered under British rule, to some extent Dutch rule, etc. And I guess that maybe because the colour extremes later on. And I'll explain that. If I'm saying that a lot of Britons were blacks, earlier on they were black, just within my own family, it only takes a generation, 2 generations maximum, for a person of black to present as white after they've married a white person, and then that person's married another lighter skinned person, another lighter skinned person. All of a sudden, within 2-3 generations, you can be very, very light, and indeed white. You know, this is what happens. It's not difficult to do it. And obviously, in the other direction, you can turn and be black. If you marry, then, you know, you marry a black, or you have children with a black person, and then that with another blacker person, then you become black. Now, obviously, black is dominant to white in terms of colour, so you can more easily turn to being perceived as being blacker than it can whiter. But with both of them, it's only a matter of 2-3 generations, depending on how you marry from there on in. Not just being married, obviously, with whom you have offspring from there on in. So it's very difficult to suggest how somebody couldn't move from black to white in Britain if the majority of people are white, which is the case. You know, so Gustavus Vassa, example, better known as Ulado Equiano now, to some of the school children will know of him, wrote about the slave trade. He was one of the individuals, Africans, who sold enslaved people. His parents sold enslaved because they were rulers of their country, sold them off to Europeans, and Europeans then sold them. I mean, he then was captured later on, mistakenly, supposedly, taken into captivity, became enslaved himself, realised what damage he's done, and then wrote many books in the 17th century about the horrors of the slave trade. So that's why he's well known. He was called Ulado Equiano, was his actual West African name, but was then given a Latin name of Gustavus Vassa, and just so you weren't surprised, they called him Gustavus Vassa the African. Now he wrote his book. Now he lived in Soham, married a white British woman, and had several children. And of course, as things went on, their offspring looked white for all intents and purposes. You wouldn't know any different. Let me give you another example of that. In Russia, you had Alexander Pushkin, the great Russian writer. Well, his grandfather was a general in the Russian armies. Well, actually what he was to start off with was he was an enslaved, they say Ethiopian, but it's more likely that he wasn't an Ethiopian. It's more likely that he was from a region in Kenya, so darker skinned, Upper Kenya, darker-skinned individual, and was taken to Turkey, where the Turks gave him about when he was 9 as a present to one of the envoys of Catherine the Great. She took him through. He was taken to her. She liked him, brought him up as a royal, which would seldom have happened in Britain, but did in Russia. And he became a royal prince as such. He was then in charge of the Russian armies. He was sent off to the best schools in France, and because in those days, the Russians looked to France as the cultural area. He was educated as an officer. He became the Russian general in charge of fortifications because he was a great architect, etc., and in charge of the Russian armies. He married a Slavic Russian woman and had children with her. Some of them had... obviously, because they were connected to the royals, they had royal connections. Indeed, part of that went into the British royal family. Other parts went into the royal families in other parts of Europe. And the famous grandson is Alexander Pushkin, one of the most famous of... Well, in fact, they do say the most famous Russian writer in the Russian language, because most Russian writers of the period were writing in French. So this guy is known as a great person. Pushkin still showed the traits of being black. He had curly hair, he had dark skin, etc., black eyes, etc. So he had that, and he actually wrote saying he was a Negro. So that's what he wrote, Pushkin himself. So he made that very, very clear. Now the reason why I mentioned Pushkin is because about 10 years ago, there was a spate of Russians now, fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, 92. There was then a spate of Russian nationalism, and there was an organisation, they called themselves the Pushkins, a little bit like the BNP, and they used to go around beating up individuals who were from other parts of what was once the Soviet Union and is now their own countries, Azerbaijan. Soviet Central Asia, they used to call them in the old days. But one of the parts of the 15 Soviet republics, which they were the Kazakhstan, places like that, who were darker skinned individuals, and they used to beat them up and tell them to go back. You're no longer part of us, get out. Blah, blah, blah. But what was ironic is that these were doing this in the name of a proper Russian patriot, Pushkin, when Pushkin himself was a mixed-race guy. So this is how history plays itself out. But of course, his later offspring, having just married amongst Russians, having offspring amongst Russians, would have been much lighter. So this is what you can find. We can also look to this same type of issue with a great, why not? Let's take a great French writer, Alexandre Dumas. Now, Alexandre Dumas, his father was a mixed race guy who was a general in Napoleon's armies, effectively second only to Napoleon. And if you read his history, there's a book out called The Black Count. Okay, he's a chevalier. That's a count in French. And what he did was he was because his father was a chevalier. His father basically was the son of a chevalier, son of a count. He lost his money in those days. A lot of these guys used to lose their money, used to just throw their money away frivolously. So he lost his money, but his brother was living in Haiti, running a slave plantation. So he went to Haiti then to try and get his wealth back, did this guy. And whilst he was in Haiti, seemingly fell in love with an enslaved black woman there. Had children from her, 3 or 4 from her. The father who had cut him off was still in France. This is the white father. This is before we get to Alexandre Dumas. But what had happened is then he learnt, because he was the oldest son, he learnt that the father was dying, so therefore the Chevalier title would come to him, and he would have the title as a count, and obviously the lands of his father he would have. So therefore, he said, I'm going to have to get back to France. So he's got 3 children, and he's got a wife in Haiti, 3 mixed race children and a black wife. So basically what he says is, I need to get my passage to get back to France. So he basically sold his wife and 2 of the sons back into slavery. And the 3rd son, which is Alexander, whom for whatever reason I guess he liked more than others, he said, I'm not going to sell you, I'm going to pawn you. So I'll pawn you off, but I will come back for you and buy you back and bring you to France, and you'll be eldest son, you'll be my eldest son, and you will take over when I die. Okay? So lo and behold, that's what he does. He sends for him later on. So Alexander comes to Paris. He goes to all of the best schools in Paris, gets educated as a count, or count's son in Paris. This is before the revolution. And becomes one of the best swordsmen in the world. And by the way, the best swordsman at the time in the whole of France was another black guy. Recently, actually, they just bought a movie out about him. This guy, who was known as, later be known as Chevalier de Saint-Georges, he was the best fencer in France and a virtuoso violinist who Marie Antoinette took to and thought that he was great. And if you've seen the BBC programme about Marie Antoinette, he's on that. And he's obviously also in the film. This is French history. This is as it was in the era just before the revolution in the 16th century. So he learns from him. And what then happens is the revolution comes along, and the chevaliers, the counts, are obviously all out of the game because the revolution changes everything. And they want to get rid of all the aristocracy. And these black people are French aristocracy. Okay? So what happened with Alexandre Dumas is he basically joins the army then as a lowly soldier, the revolutionary army this is, because he believes in the revolution, because under the revolution, slavery is abandoned. And he believes in the revolution, he becomes a revolutionary. And he rises through the ranks and becomes a general. Basically, cut a long story short, he fights in the French Revolutionary Army. He challenges Napoleon. He's the one who actually takes Napoleon's armies into Egypt and conquers Egypt, albeit that he said it was an unwise action because he knew he'd got to get them back. And he was right, because in the end, the Revolutionary Army loses a lot of men in Egypt. And he then is travelling back to France, is imprisoned and put in a prison. And that's where his son writes The Man in the Iron Mask. His son writes The Three Musketeers. His son is basically Alexandre Dumas Frère, the son of, and he's the guy who writes all of these famous yarns that we know from France that have been written, and great pieces of literature. So what I'm saying is, those are just 2 European countries that I've just chosen just like that, where blacks could get on very easily. It is more difficult for blacks in Britain to do that, albeit that I did tell you that the great writer who wrote about the slave trade, which is what his prominence is, of course, Gustavus Vassa or Rolando Acriano writes, and he did become famous and lived particularly well. Now, that was because of the laws which were then perceived in England, where England's air is too free for anybody to breathe that air who is enslaved. So that's the Lord Salisbury's proclamation that came after that in that trial. So what I'm saying is that black history in that sense, we've just covered bits of European black history, and there are many. There's going to be 1,001 normal, everyday people who are of colour, be they darker or lighter, who are perceived as black because that's how they were seen. Yeah, it's just that's the way they were seen. You don't need to be a full-blown black person to be seen as black, and never have been in what I would call Northern Europe. Now, in Southern Europe, that's been different. In Southern Europe, for many, many a year, people with lighter skin than the full black person has been perceived differently than as a person with darker black skin, because that's the way they needed to perceive it, because of the victory of the Moors, and because the whole of Iberia, southern Italy, southern France was run by the Moors. So you wouldn't turn around and say, these black people, so you wouldn't turn around and say blacks are only people who are anything. You'd only be them specific, and that's the danger of it. There's a specific denotation for blacks, the same way as you get in Brazil, by the way. In Brazil, because most Brazilians perceive themselves, to 90% actually, as having mixed heritage, right? You're only white if you look pure white. And then you are mixed if you look otherwise, and black if you look pure black, if you get what the sense is. There's no such thing as pure white, there's no such thing as pure black. But that's as it's perceived. Same if you go into the Middle East. If you go into the Middle East, go into Saudi Arabia, you'll see a whole host of people who, if they were walking around in America, would be black, but in the Middle East they're not black. They are perceived, probably, if they perceive colour in that sense at all, as white, but as just Arab. The ones that they look to be Arab who may have once been enslaved. Now, by the way, not all Arab blacks were enslaved, in fact, by no means whatsoever, because the blacks used to control the whole area. Later on, they were part of the slave trade. So they would be the ones who would only be seen as black, if you see what I mean. That goes for India, where some of the Maharajas were ex-Sudanese soldiers, so very, very black. They were ex-Sudanese soldiers, and then they married locals, but they basically became Maharajas and ran some of the old Indian empires, particularly in the regions around which some of it's now Pakistan and some of it would be India now, in today's parlance of language and today's states. So you see, this thing moves along all the time with different people being looked at differently. Same in the whole of South America and the whole of Central America. You know, the first Argentine president, actually, the first free Argentine president, when they freed themselves from the Spanish, supposedly from the Spanish, whatever that means, was a mixed race guy. But now you look at Argentina and people talk about Argentina as being white. Well, actually, you know, that was not the case. So there you go. This is how there's a misunderstanding of what things are. Well, I think what I'm going to do is actually leave this as part one, where I've given you an explanation of race, of what we call race, and then hit on part two next week with a better understanding of more modern black history in Britain and beyond. See you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.